Hello, everybody. It's Michael Hollands once again for Sound of the Movies. Today I have the pleasure to be joined by two-time Oscar winner Mark Mangini. On today's episode, we will talk about his distinguished career and also cover his work on Dune, for which he won his second Oscar. It is my pleasure to welcome Mark Mangini.
You make me blush, and you can't see that on a.
Well, I can.
That's far too much praise, but thank you, Michael. It's
Yeah,
a
I mean,
pleasure to be here.
you deserve all the praise in the world actually for your fantastic contributions to the world of cinema. You've worked on so many movies. The body of work is just phenomenal, and you have been working in this industry for more than 40 years actually. My first question may seem kind of generic because I'm sure you get asked a lot, but I think it's important to talk about the inspiration to get into this business. And I'm sure there are or have been many movies which you would credit as an inspiration to choose this line of work. Anything that comes to mind?
Sure. Well, I think that was two questions. To answer the first question about the inspiration for getting into sound, starts when I was 16 years old, and it was a family tradition to watch the Academy Awards at home. And I was a a young student filmmaker. I loved hand drawing animation and doing stop motion animation. And in 1975, I was 18, and I saw the Academy Awards, and a light bulb went off. I was just so inspired by seeing people being recognized in a very public forum for their creative work. I finally put two and two together, and I realized, wait a minute, I love movies, and that's a real career, and that's what I have to do. And at the time, I was in university studying foreign languages. I was going to be a translator for the UN. That's what I thought I would do for a living. But only because I had this crazy idea that I had to pursue something academic. And I was completely ignoring the creative side of what I really loved to do in life. So I saw the Academy Awards, and I literally came to LA because that was my inspiration. I thought, that is the world I want to live in, a world of creatives who express themselves through their ideas. Then But at the time, I didn't know people do what I do for a living. I had no idea there was such a thing as a sound designer or a sound editor or a re-recording mixer. And it was, as it would turn out, my first introduction to any real meaningful paid work was at Hanna-Barbera Studios. They are famous for Saturday morning's children's cartoons like the Flintstones and Scooby-Doo and things like that. And the job they offered me was in the sound department. Being a musician and having been a musician, I took to that very quickly. I have a good ear, and I grew rapidly in my success. And what really catapulted me, and this part of the story is very banal, was seeing Star Wars and Apocalypse Now. Those two films, but mostly Star Wars. I was a run-of-the-mill punch the clock sound editor at Hanna-Barbera until I saw Star Wars and I heard Star Wars and I realized, boy, sound can really make a contribution in ways that I had never dreamed of. And that's when I dedicated myself to becoming somebody maybe as good as Ben Burt, who to me is still, he's an icon in my universe. One of the greats, if not the greatest sound designer I know. And I wanted to be something like that and do something as significant. So that film, and then Apocalypse, and even Close Encounters of the Third Kind were films that deeply influenced me when I was 19, 20 years old and set me on a path to wanting to just be good at it.
Great. And you've mentioned great movies, Mark. I mean, Star Wars, I mean, that goes without saying. And Ben Burt, and also Apocalypse Now. I think that was Walter Murch, if I'm not mistaken. Yes, fantastic work. Also an Academy Award winner. Mark, if I'm not mistaken, you work as a sound designer, a sound editor, and you also work on the mix. Am I correct?
And I would add to that, the fourth leg of that table that supports everything is field recording. I love going out and recording. And you could see behind me a rack of microphones and recorders. So
Great.
I'm sorry, I interrupted your question.
No, you didn't. It's fine. Thank you, Mark. Many people, I think, do not necessarily know the difference between mixing and sound design. So if I may ask, could you try to explain the difference?
Let's start with sound designer. Sound designer is not an immediately accepted term in the world sound community because it's a little bit controversial. But in my worldview, a sound designer is to a director for sound as a cinematographer is to a director for image. The director turns to the cinematographer or the director of photography for virtually everything visual. The cinematographer ultimately will be responsible for how something looks on the screen. Of course, they have to work with production designers and set decorators and costumers and any one of a number of other vital creative crafts. But the cinematographer ultimately is the one that has to decide and capture it in a way that is visually pleasing and follows the director's vision for a film. So too does a sound designer work with a director to achieve the aural result, the sonic result that they hear in their head. And it is through that relationship that the sound designer then works with other important departments in sound like ADR and Foley and field recording and sound editing and sound mixing to achieve the overall result that the director is pursuing. So a sound designer can do a number of things that include creating sound you've never heard before. That's sort of the purest version of sound design. On a movie like Dune or Blade Runner, there's any one of a number of things. There's literally thousands of things that don't exist in real life that have to be created. You can't go to a sound library to get them, and you can't go out in the world to record a sandworm or a body shield or a thumper or a spinner. These are the kinds of things that make science fiction such a fun genre to work in sound. So a sound designer may do things like create new sounds, record new sounds, edit them, and then maybe perhaps even mix them later on at the final portion of post-production sound. A sound editor is responsible for taking some component of a film. A film is 2 hours long, generally speaking, and there are lots of sounds that were recorded or designed, but they haven't been synchronized with the image. It is their responsibility to take those elements, bring them into a tool, a non-linear editing tool, and synchronize them with the image. That in that process, they are being creative by layering and juxtaposing sound in ways that you've never heard before to create a sonic result that didn't perhaps exist in reality. The mixer or the re-recording mixer is the person who is responsible for taking all the sounds that have been designed, recorded, and edited, and then combining them, mixing them together into a pleasing single whole. A mixer is or a re-recording mixer, which is the preferred term in cinema, is the equivalent of the record engineer in a record studio. You have the band making all there's guitars and basses and drums and synthesizers, all making these individual channels of audio, but all of that has to be combined into a pleasing finished song. That takes an extraordinary set of ears and creativity to make something we want to listen to, and then combine it into a recording that can play on the radio or you can download from iTunes or something like that. So the mixer's job is to take often an extraordinary number of channels. And to give you an example, on Mad Max, probably the widest film I've ever worked on, we had over 2,000 individual channels of audio playing sometimes simultaneously. Imagine the job required to synthesize all of that down to the one track that plays in the cinema. An extraordinary amount of creativity and hard work goes into that. And then finally, the field recordist, I think, was the fourth leg, is an individual who goes out into the real world with a microphone and a recorder offline from image. They're not concerned with synchronizing to the image, and they're capturing real sounds, real acoustic sounds as raw elements to create, for lack of a better term, a palette for the sound editors to then synchronize to the image. So think of the field recordist as perhaps the writer. A writer creates words, but the words aren't a performance. An actor interprets words, and that becomes a performance. So too does, say, a field recordist create the words, the individual components that are then assembled into a cohesive whole, and that becomes part of the finished soundtrack to a film.
Great.
Did I explain them all?
I think you did, and thank you very much for your elaborate answer. I think that was a great one. You just mentioned Mad Max, and actually yesterday I was rewatching Mad Max Fury Road, for which you won your first Academy Award, your first Oscar. This film, I believe, must be a dream come true for you to work on, because it simply, I think, offers so much. There is so much going on, lots of action, the sound of the war rig, the motorcycles, weapons, perfecting sounds of automatic weapons, because as I understand, oftentimes you simply cannot capture everything using a microphone, and you have the production tracks, the sound of the weapons, but then after the fact you walk into your studio and then you decide how forceful the weapon should be, or which sound may be appropriate.
You bring up an interesting topic about Mad Max, because what might not be understood by non-practitioners is this idea that when you're making the film, when George Miller is on location capturing the film photographically and sonically, the goal sonically is to make sure you get the dialogue. The microphones are built and placed to capture the words that the actors are uttering. What that means is that even though you see them in trucks and motorcycles and vehicles, and they were all practical vehicles, they all had real engines, they all actually could drive, the microphones aren't capturing quality sound for that aspect of the audio. The microphones are there to make sure you hear what the actors say. That means the microphone isn't pointed towards the muffler or the engine where you want, that's where the good sound is coming from. So although it looks like you could just take the sound captured while the film is shot, you very rarely can. And this is one of the extraordinary aspects of Mad Max that is a real nod to how brilliant George Miller is. George Miller understood this, and in his budget, in pre-production, he allocated money so that Ben Osmo and his team and Oliver Machin could go out and record every one of those crazy vehicles, and there were hundreds. And he allocated money to do second unit audio. Second unit means somebody who's off doing something while the main unit is actually making the movie. This is very common for photography. There's often a second unit camera person capturing the vehicles driving and doing all and blowing up, but no one ever allocates money to do the sound for that. George allocated money so that we could capture every one of those vehicles and motorcycles in a high fidelity way, so that when we came back to post-production, we had the actual sounds recorded as we wanted them recorded, so that we could augment the recordings that Ben Osmo is making while they were capturing principal photography. Correct. That's quite extraordinary.
Wow. It's a big movie. It won 6 Academy Awards. And
I'm happy to say, by the way, so did Dune.
Yes, yes.
There's this lovely symmetry where we won almost the same awards, 6 years later.
Yeah, Dune also won 6 Academy Awards. Mark, you also need to at times enhance voices or manipulate voices, because an actor's or actress's voice can only be tweaked to a certain degree. And let's say, for instance, Mad Max or Dune, the Reverend Mother, or on Mad Max, the Emperor, he has a very strong and forceful voice. And then he also has this respiratory device.
Yeah, that's the real fun and the challenge in science fiction and fantasy films like these, that you have the opportunity to go outside the boundaries of the way we normally hear. And of course, we have a lovely precedent set by Ben Burtt in the voice of Darth Vader in Star Wars. You could see that breathing device on the Vader costume, and Ben very inventively developed a way of hiding a microphone inside some scuba equipment to create those sounds that made James Earl Jones's voice so much more rich and interesting and menacing. Not that his voice isn't tremendous already.
Yes.
So too did we with Immortan Joe. He had that bizarre bellows mechanism, and David White and I had to develop that, asthmatic, like wheezing, pressurized breathing augmentation device to augment his voice. And also he happens to be speaking behind this very creepy looking translucent mask. And as would happen, we brought that actor back into the recording studio to not only get a more proximate recording. We wanted the microphone to be right here, but in production, Ben could only get a shotgun microphone just off frame, and you couldn't get the chest resonance. He was a very large man, and we wanted the deepness of his voice, the resonance of a big set of lungs and chest. So we brought that actor back into the recording studio, and he reread or re-performed his lines in a process that we call ADR. That stands for automated dialogue replacement. That simply means that the actor is in a controlled recording studio, looking at the image, listening on a set of headphones, and reproducing in sync what they had said on location, but with a really high quality microphone right where we want it. And that gave us that extra sort of size and prominence that we wanted the character to have. The challenge on Dune was wholly different. Frank Herbert described in the book the use of a weapon called the voice. This was something that somebody trained in the Bene Gesserit ways could utilize as a weapon to manipulate the thoughts of an adversary to get them to do your bidding. And we needed to figure out a way to have Paul and Lady Jessica use this tool. And what did that sound like? What does it sound like to speak in a way that the audience would understand and yet convinced you that it had enough power to convince someone else to do your bidding? You probably spoke to Theo about this, and maybe you'll cut in Theo's interview as part of this presentation about our process of developing the voice that included a number of interesting tools. One was this narrative idea that in deploying the voice, you were summoning an ancient ancestor, an ancient, powerful female ancestor. And that you, at times when deploying the voice, that ancestor was speaking through you. And so in the film, sometimes you see somebody use the voice and you only hear the voice of the ancient ancestor. Sometimes you hear the voice and multiple voices of ancestors in a cloud that we called witchy bubbles. And sometimes we overlaid it with Paul or Jessica's voice to imply that they needed the extra firepower of these ancestors. So there was that narrative idea that we developed. We also wanted it to really hit you in the gut, so that you really got the idea that this voice had power and you didn't want to defy it. So Theo developed this beautiful modulated low frequency rumble that tracked the ups and downs of the voice itself so that it modulated along with the voice. And that we put into the subwoofer and several other speakers to give some of the power. We also wanted to develop this idea that that the using the voice was a process one had to go through and learn to be proficient in. So in the early scenes with the voice, he's not very good with it, and his voice is out of sync with himself. Mm-hmm. We came with this concept that he could, deploying the voice defied the laws of physics. You could open your mouth, but no sound would come out, and it would be retarded some number of seconds later and then be deployed. And as you develop proficiency with it, like learning a musical instrument, you got better and better at it, and your performances became more and more effective.
Great. Thank you very much, Mark. I can see the guitars in the background, and you are also you're also
and a sousaphone.
Yes, and you are also a musician. You play the guitar, and you've also made contributions to films, musical contributions. And Theo, of course, is also a composer. I can imagine this being like the perfect scenario to be able to write music, to look at the film, to handle the sound design, and to also talk to the composer or composers in order to enhance their vision or to collaborate with them. Or this is where we want music, and maybe you can use the synthesized sound, or if the music is going to be orchestral, maybe we can add something here. How does it usually work in your experience?
Well, you bring up a really important topic for anyone who deigns to be a sound designer or supervisor or mixer or editor, and that is that there's only one soundtrack, and there are two principal creatives involved in building it, the composer, of course, and the sound designer. The best soundtracks are achieved through a collaboration, because in a sense, if there's one soundtrack, there might only really be one composer of sound. But there's these two heads of departments, and the best solution is for them to work collaboratively and very closely to achieve a symmetry. And that is currently a non-traditional approach. Most composers, most film schools don't teach this. They don't teach this idea that there's only one soundtrack and everyone has to be working towards its highest goals. And we need to develop a language and a modality where there is much more collaboration happening in the development of the sound of a movie. Because sound means music and sound effects and everything else, than is currently prescribed. And so, as I'm sure Theo said to you on Blade Runner 2049, as well as on Dune and on especially on Mad Max Fury Road, we worked with those composers, Hans Zimmer and Junkie XL, Tom Holkenborg, very closely to have a harmonious approach that made the most sense for the success of the film, not our individual efforts. It's very easy in this arena to become quite self-absorbed with your work. You know, you sit in a studio and you slave over a music cue, or you slave over the design of a sound that no one's ever heard before, and a week later you have some brilliant epiphany and you found a success that the director loves, only to find out that the composer did the same thing, and now you're kind of clashing. And it's very human nature to feel like, well, I want my sound to be heard, and the composer saying, well, I want my cue to be heard, and mine's better, and the whole goal is to pull all that ego out of the process, because all you're really trying to achieve is what's best for the movie, what most serves the film. And those are the questions you should always be asking yourself, whether you're a composer or a sound designer. What serves the film most? And if you do that long before the final mix, when those battles might occur, you can avoid most of them happening in the first place.
Great, thank you.
So I just wanted to touch on Mad Max Fury Road. We were all ensconced in Sydney, Australia, and Tom Holkenborg and I became friends, and we would meet for coffee every morning at 7 a.m., and we would talk about the day. And because we were so sort of clustered together, for weeks, we would have those conversations before we arrived at the studio to sort of implement the work. And we found a beautiful way of solving problems that then we would present to George Miller upon arrival at the studio and say, hey, Tom and I were talking and we thought this would be a good approach. And we organically grew that soundtrack together.
Right. And it's also, I think, very important to not only offer your opinion on something, but to also listen, because I think that's the essence of collaboration. Trying to pitch in, or trying to get everybody to pitch in, offer your opinion. This is what I think is right versus what somebody else may think is right. Then you need to brainstorm, and ultimately you need to serve the picture, because that, as you said, is the most important thing. Sometimes it can be difficult to, let's say, check your ego at the door, because you want your contribution to be heard. That's what you just said. Right. But ultimately, it's the team effort which gets you there.
Beautifully said. The funny thing is, after I've done this for 46 years, and that was hard to do in the beginning. Yeah. It's hard to let go. But once you kind of tune in on this idea that the most important thing is what's best for the movie, mm-hmm. it often becomes, in my experience, self-evident mm-hmm. what is right for the movie. So mm-hmm. even though you might want something of yours to be heard, it's not so hard to swallow that loss of a victory when you realize that when you look at the scene objectively and you sit with the director, and this is what we did on Mad Max. Every day it was the mixers and George Miller and Tom Holkenborg and myself. And it was just a collective, you'd watch a scene and once you sort of looked at it all together with everyone in the room, you realize, oh yeah, that music cue really carries this. We really got to duck down all those truck noises. Those decisions became pretty easy to make. And so I've found a comfortable place, because once I let go, knowing what's best for the movie is best for me, it's a lot easier for those conversations to take place. Right. And you said maybe the most important thing of all, and that is listening. I know that I am hired for my point of view. Therefore, it is incumbent upon me to express myself in a way that transmits what I think are the values of my ideas. They're not to the exclusion of another good idea. Whenever I present an idea, my tone is, I had this idea. In this scene, I felt like these sounds work really great because they connect us to another moment in the movie earlier, and we get that connective tissue and we get some symmetry here. That's my pitch. And then the director has the ability to analyze those ideas in juxtaposition with someone else's idea and make an informed decision. So if you don't give your ideas, you're robbing the director of what they came to you for in the first place. But that doesn't mean your ideas come to the exclusion of someone else's. They're simply a contribution that have to be analyzed.
Absolutely, because everybody, after all, is hired for a reason. They hire you or Theo or Hans Zimmer or Ben Wallfish or James Newton Howard, any composer, sound designer, director. So you are there for a specific reason, because you can bring something to the table which somebody else may not be able to bring to the table. But ultimately, of course, you have so many colleagues and peers that are also masters of their craft, and then everything, comes together, and that's the essence of collaboration, I believe. I also need to bring up your variety as far as your work is concerned. I mean, you have worked on so many films. Star Trek: The Motion Picture. You have worked on Raiders of the Lost Ark. You've worked with director Joe Dante a couple of times on... Also,
9 times.
Nine times. Also on The Burbs, if I'm not mistaken. And yes,
2 Gremlins movies with Joe.
Yes, Gremlins. And you've worked on Lethal Weapon 4, Die Hard with a Vengeance. You've worked on The Green Mile. I mean, it's such a variety. I mean, drama, action, horror, suspense. You have conspiracy theory by Richard Donner.
By the way,
Yeah.
one of Hans Zimmer's first movies, Cool Runnings, a movie
Yes.
about the Jamaican bobsled team, a movie I am so immensely proud of, and it's so funny.
Yeah, I mean, yes, I love Cool Runnings, also a Disney movie, and you've worked with Disney a couple of times, also on The Lion King and also on Aladdin,
Yep, and Beauty and the Beast.
and Beauty and the Beast. I was going to ask you also about Cool Runnings, or I was going to mention it at least because it's also one of my favorite films of the '90s, and it's just a brilliant comedy, and let's say such a rewarding experience every time that I watch it.
I have fond memories of Cool Runnings because I did 4 films with John Turteltaub, and we developed a friendship. And I think we succeeded in some ways that well beyond what we ever imagined. All my collaborations with Joe Dante were extraordinary because he's just a great communicator, and he's a cineast and a film lover and a film collector and a film historian. And just hanging out with Joe when you're not working on the movie always made it fun. And Joe, like all these great directors, like John Turteltaub, like Gavin O'Connor, like Steven Spielberg, like Denis Villeneuve, like George Miller. These are the essence of their greatness lies in their ability to collaborate and trust the people that they surround themselves with, and they let you go off and experiment and play and fail and succeed. And Denis. I always recorded our sessions together, and someday I'm going to ask his permission to publish them, because one of the joys of working with Denis and all of these gentlemen was their ability to understand that the creative process is one of destruction and rebuilding. And Theo and I were always allowed to go off and experiment without any interaction from Denis or Joe Walker, our film editor. And then maybe a month, 2 months in, we have our first meeting and we get to present all our crazy ideas. And without remember, we've had zero guidance. Denis has encouraged us to let our imaginations run wild. And so, Theo and I might play 15 or 20 sounds, and maybe 15 of them fail. But Denis always said when he didn't like something, he would never say, I don't like that. What he would say was, I see where you're going with that. I don't think it works, but maybe that leads us in this direction. So, in that famous, what's that Zen expression or Buddhist expression, when you lose, you don't lose the lesson. Denis is a master in that. When you don't have a success, that failure points you to where the success really is. So you can't find the success until you fail a little bit. Yes. All of these directors recognize that as part of the creative process. And it's just so uplifting to work in that environment, because you always feel encouraged to do something interesting or experimental. And that's when the big successes happen.
Yes. And you just brought something up, which I think is very important and also interesting. Skills in terms of communication or let's say be sympathetic to somebody, try to encourage somebody, even though you feel they have done the wrong thing.
What I've discovered as a useful tool is in motivating people, because I have a lot of people I'm working with, and I need to review a lot of people's individual work output. And if I find that in those review processes, a piece of work isn't achieving the goal, see, there is no objective universe where something is bad or unacceptable. Clearly the person worked hard. Clearly the person had a goal in mind. Clearly the person felt as though they had achieved success. So far be it from me to criticize it. The way to get achieve the success that one needs is to focus on what the objective is. Once you understand what the objective is, then it is easier to guide in that direction. So if I didn't like something I had just heard in a review session, my comments would always be, here's what the director has indicated is the goal of this scene emotionally, dramatically, or sonically. And I don't think this is getting us in that direction. I think we need to focus the work in this other direction, and that's going to get us the success that we want, because this is what we are trying to achieve dramatically or sonically. And that just simply helps refocus the individual to rethink the work and represent, because the work as presented is not wrong. It just isn't achieving the goals that we've all set for ourselves. And perhaps the important thing for me to recognize is maybe I miscommunicated. Maybe it isn't good in an objective sense or even a subjective sense because I didn't communicate the goal correctly. So of course, I have to look at my participation in that negotiation, in that relationship, to see if I had actually given the correct direction in the first place.
And the door swings both ways, as they say.
Yeah. Yo, that's a good one.
Yes, I mean,
you know, it's funny. I have to cop to. There's an editor in Los Angeles, Lee Gilmore, who I love to work with. He's just one of the greats, and he caught me in one of my moments of weakness when I came in to review a reel he was working on, and there was some work that I thought wasn't quite right. And now every time I see him, he says this. He said, "Mark, you know what you said to me?" "No." He said, "You said to me, well, that's an approach," which was a very sort of Teflon way of trying to avoid a confrontation about the fact that I didn't think he had gone in the direction I wanted him to go in. So all I simply stated was the obvious, is that, yes, he had found an approach, but it wasn't the approach that I had wanted. So it was kind of an unctuous way of avoiding the topic or being non-confrontational. And now we joke about it. So,
who do you think is the most specific director you ever worked with?
Well, I'm going to go in the opposite direction with Denis Villeneuve. Denis is one of the greatest directors I've ever worked with because of his non-specificity. And I'm going to use the term specificity very, very carefully, because I equate specificity with micromanagement, meaning telling you everything to do for every single sound that they want to hear. Denis works from a very different standpoint. Denis works from a narrative, emotional standpoint. So, for example, whereas some directors, you're in a final mix and you've turned out the lights and you've played a reel, a 20-minute section of the film. This is very common. You work in small chunks of a movie. You never work on the whole 2 hours. So we've done our work. We've designed, edited, and mixed, and the director comes in and sits in the mixing theater. You turn the lights out and you play the 20-minute reel one, opening of the movie. The lights come up, and it's the director's job to give you the creative notes. What do we need to do to finish this mix to make sure it sounds exactly the way he or she wants it to sound? Most directors will have a laundry list, 20, 30, 40, 50 bullet points of, okay, at 1 minute, 30 seconds, I want to make the worm sound louder. At 2 minutes and 45 seconds, you have to lower the music. And you go down the list one by one. You collectively address those notes until the mix is satisfactory to the director. Denis doesn't do that. Denis watches that same 20-minute section of the film, and his notes are usually things like, scene 52, I need it to feel a little scarier. Or, it all comes from a story, or in scene 17, I don't feel like we connected to scene 2 because we're in this different universe now, and I need to feel connected to scene 2. All of his commentary is story and emotion based, and he still then leaves it to us as his collaborators to figure out the specific ways to achieve the emotional beats. That's very unusual for most directors.
Right.
Now, the opposite end of that spectrum, George Miller was not necessarily the most specific director, but he had a methodology that speaks to specificity. And that was this. When I first arrived in Sydney, I was shown this chart of a pyramid. And I'm embarrassed because I'm forgetting what he called it, but I'll just call it the pyramid of importance. And at the top, he called it top of the pyramid. In any given shot in his films, there is one primary sound and one visual focus. And in Mad Max, there's probably 2,600 individual shots in the movie. And for all 2,500 of those, we, as his collaborators, needed to be aware of what the visual focus was and what the sonic focus was. Even if in that shot, there were lots of things to look at and lots of things to potentially listen to, we needed to be aware of what his sonic focus is, what the top of the pyramid was. And that's what we were always trying to achieve on a macro basis. So it was very granular. We would stop on shots and discuss, what do we want to hear here? I know there are guns firing, there's explosions going off, there's truck engines roaring, there's music chugging away, there's people talking. What do we want? What's the sonic focus of this one shot? Let's get to that. Okay, maybe we only achieved 2 seconds in an hour's worth of work. Okay, move on to the next shot. And we would do that, rinse and repeat, as we say, until we completed a pass on the film. Now, that's a very granular approach. Once you're done with that, you want to step way back and watch it all and forget about what you just did and see if you've achieved something beautiful. Now you can repeat and figure out maybe that wasn't the focus, or if that is the focus, it's detracting from something later, and you work collaboratively to find the best result.
Right. Thank you, Mark. And we previously talked about collaboration, also communication, and I have a nice quote, or respectively, it's more an analogy. Somebody once said to me, a director doesn't speak composer, a director speaks director, and it's the composer's job to not only speak their own language, but to also interpret the director's language. Do you have any thoughts on that in terms of your work, in terms of language?
Yeah, I have a number of thoughts on it. The first is, the theme of that conversation is half of our job as artists and sound composers and sound designers is the technical aspect of it. We know how to make sounds and edit sounds and mix sounds. But to be really successful in your career, you need to be a people person. You need to learn the psychological skills of how to read people and how to understand them. And some directors have an incredible training in sound, and they can use the language we use or you use to communicate. But others don't have the language skills, and they have to use metaphors. I did a movie with the great comedian writer Mel Brooks, and he had a huge training in jazz and classical music. And so to communicate with me, he used musical metaphors to describe what he wanted out of the sound. And he also was a painter, and he used graphic terms and colors. I mean, he would literally say to me, I want that to sound green. What is the sound of green? So, you then begin this education process on your own of trying to deconstruct what you think it meant to him by contrasting it with when he said, well, I want that to sound blue. Oh, all right. Oh, blue. Now I see blue means sad. That's an easy association. That's what that meant for that scene. So maybe green means verdant, or it means exciting or springing to life. And so you start developing these metaphorical associations. So what I'm saying is that part of one's success in what one does is derived from one's ability to communicate and understand people. And that's why when I lecture about sound, I lecture that on top of the technical and creative skills specific to sound, there are 4 other key areas of learning that everyone must develop to be really successful. And that is, you should study psychology and how to read people. You have to be able to read people's moods and how to interpret them. You should study acting because you have to, and in association with acting, writing, because you need to be able to deconstruct the dramatic beats of a film, because until you understand the dramatic beats of a film, you don't know how to design sound for it, because design is all about supporting the emotion. This is exactly what composers do. And finally, you need to study public speaking and become comfortable with it, because you need to learn to express yourself and how to express yourself effectively. And until you learn how to do that, you haven't learned how to communicate effectively with a director. Because if you only come at a director with, conversations that include sample rates and speaker dispersion and kilohertz and gigawatts, if you're speaking that language, you're not communicating to the rest of the people you need to communicate with, who speak in completely different terms about drama and character arc. You need to speak that language.
Great. Thank you very much, Mark. And if we still have a couple of minutes left, I would like to briefly talk about animation, because I mentioned, Lion King and also Aladdin. When you start working on a film, and I'm sure on many occasions you also use the script as inspiration, they present the final product. Well, not the final product, but a rough cut of a film. And it has either been shot in camera and the visual effects need to be added, but you get the picture and you start working on certain sounds or enhance them or synthesize them. What's it like working on an animated picture?
Well, there's a wide spectrum there of involvement. What's interesting is it depends on how early one is engaged in an animation project. On Beauty and the Beast, when I started the film, half of the film was still in storyboard, hand drawn, and this is back still in film days, hand drawn storyboards, and you're designing sounds that the editor will bring into the story reel. And sometimes that can become inspiration to the animators to actually draw to, because you've established a timing for something that they would have done maybe intuitively without a sound as the inspiration for that. VFX are animation also. And so on movies like Blade Runner and Dune, Theo and I made sounds early on before there were VFX, and the VFX would then animate the computer-generated animation to what we had created, and used it as inspiration for the final visual look. And in some cases, that was a back and forth that happened 2 or 3 times as we refined each other's ideas. They might hear something, animate to it, and then add an element that was some clever idea of the animator, and we saw that and we were like, oh, you're going to do that, we'll do this. And it might exchange 2 or 3 times, and it became this very organic growth process that is greater than the sum of the parts. In hand-drawn animation, that's less likely to happen, but it can happen. The beauty of animation is that, unlike what we call live action, movies shot in the real world, everything in animation in sound starts with a complete build from the blank slate. You have no sync track per se. You have the voices, but they're beautifully recorded in a controlled recording studio. That means the atmospheres and environments are all available for me to build and create or record from scratch, and build in a very pristine way. I'm not tied to a recording that was captured downtown in the city with traffic and airplanes flying overhead and all sorts of sound polluting that recording. All of that allows the sound designer to build up from scratch in a very controlled manner. And often we sound designers love working in animation because everything has been built from whole cloth. So we have complete control over it. That's always exciting.
Great. And thank you, Mark. And storyboards, that's the term I I meant to
Yeah,
use, but I drew a blank on that one. Is there anything else you would like to add about your career, about your profession? Anything else that comes to mind? Because I don't want to take too much of your time. And if you have a couple of minutes left, is there anything else you would like to add?
I'm trying to think of what are the really important lessons that I've learned. We touched on this a little bit, but I think it's very important. This is also banal. You read this in art school manuals about the importance of being true to yourself.
Yes.
I early in my career wanted to be like others that I admired, and I found that that was at the expense of discovering who I was as a sound designer. And so I'll repeat that oft recited trope that one needs to be true to oneself. Find out who you are and learn to express yourself and your ideas, because that's going to be the key to your success, because you will be valued and appreciated for your uniqueness, and you need to be unique. You want to be sought out by directors because of who you are, not because of whom you imitate. I would also, the other advice I give often is that the way to be great at this is to do it every day and to apply yourself daily, even when you're not being paid. I feel as though that's part of my success, is that even when I'm not on a project, I am still recording, I'm editing, I'm designing, I'm mixing, I'm doing pro bono work for young up and coming filmmakers and directors. I'm trying to give back to the community in the form of education and teaching. The more you practice, the better you get at it. And think of it much in the way that an athlete trains. Just because Lionel Messi is not playing for Paris Saint-Germain, he knows he has to exercise those skills every day in the training ground, so that in the game environment, they are second nature. When your skills become second nature, that frees the creative brain to jump in and do something that transcends the skill set. You have to learn to dribble the ball and shoot on goal, but until that's second nature, you don't know how to do that exceptionally.
Yes, and practice makes perfect, of course, too.
Yeah, it's sad but true.
It's sad but
There's
true.
no shortcut. No shortcuts.
Yes, it is sad but true. As you just mentioned, you need to work on your skills on a daily basis. I think working in this environment, working in this business, or in any business, everybody's input and everybody's opinion is basically important, even if somebody else has a better idea. But it's important to work on it in order to achieve a goal, and I think that's hugely important. And Mark,
So true.
Mark, I know we cannot cover everything today, and I would love to talk to you again down the road to maybe talk about something you did in the 70s or 80s, to cover different films.
That would be fun. Yeah.
And I would like
Hey,
to.
can I plug? Can I
Yeah,
put in one plug?
yeah.
Most people don't know it because it's so hard to find. But I have a blog, and it's got over 200 entries that cover my career for 46 years. It's at markmangini.com. And if you ever have questions, if you're a young filmmaker, I have 4 postings on advice to young filmmakers. I have advanced stuff, and I'm really proud of it. And if you want to learn more about my process, go to markmangini.com, and maybe you'll enjoy it.
Great. Mark, thank you so very much for taking so much time out of your schedule. I really appreciate that, and I had a great time talking to you, and I hope you enjoyed the conversation as well.
Beautifully researched. Thank you, Michael.